Right, so Israel likes to talk about choices. The world is told that Gazans choose violence through Hamas, that activists choose provocation rather than cooperation, that Tel Aviv itself chooses restraint. But the choice offered to the Global Sumud Flotilla last night was no choice at all. Hand your flour and medicine to Israel at Ashkelon, or be branded terrorists. The convoy refused, of course. And then, of course, Israel showed their true colours, didn't they? Out came the drones, buzzing overhead like wasps, dropping flashbangs onto civilian decks, jamming radios as though imposing silence could save their collapsing story. This was not Israel displaying strength, but its fear and its weakness, that their siege of Gaza is so brittle that baby milk and bandages terrify it. Effectively, what Israel did was beg the flotilla to help them save face, and they were rebuffed, and as a result lashed out with their toys of war being thrown out of the proverbial pram that made it look less like a regional superpower and more like a panicking bully, afraid because somebody is prepared to stand up to them. In this case, 50-plus boats that refuse to deviate from their course. Right, so the prelude to last night's attacks on the Global Sumud Flotilla was supposed to be simple. Israel dangled what it called a lifeline. Bring your flour and medicine to Ashkelon, unload it under our watch, and we will deliver it into Gaza, we promise. A promise based on their previous pledges regarding aid, being certainly a case of, well, we'll see what trickles into Gaza, won't we? What we permit. Accept these terms. Accept our blockade. Accept the siege of Gaza. Accept that Israel alone decides what counts as aid, what gets in. So, of course, the flotilla refused. They kept on sailing, and overnight the pretense of generosity from Israel was quickly stripped away by the whine of drones and the crack of explosions and the fizz of stun grenades raining onto civilian decks. A state that insists it is unshakable revealed itself as brittle instead, rattled by the possibility that its siege might end up being pierced not by an army, but by a convoy of civilians instead. And that is the core of this story, not Israel's strength, but its fear and its weakness. A siege advertised as ironclad begins to creak the moment unarmed civilians challenge it in numbers. A blockade that claims legality starts to look like piracy once the cameras catch drones spraying chemicals over aid ships in international waters. What Israel tried to stage as an act of magnanimity, offering Ashkelon as the safe route for them, the Hunger Games customs office as it basically is, where nothing will end up being declared, has already unravelled into a spectacle of panic. Because once you strip the rhetoric away, what remains is clear. Israel cannot allow Gaza to receive aid except through its grip. When that grip is challenged, it lashes out clumsily, revealing just how brittle the blockade really is and how childish they are by way of response, which leads me to this tweet from the official Twitter account of the State of Israel itself, at Israel, which reads, "Is why they said no. They understood what Ashkelon meant. It meant surrendering the mission's point, legitimising the siege itself. To have accepted would have been to let Israel dictate not only who starves, but who gets to be called a humanitarian too. So by refusing, they keep the moral ground. And by refusing, they set in motion the escalation that, of course, came afterwards." Last night showed the world what Israel's necessary measures look like in practice. And many foreign and alternative media outlets from Al Jazeera, France 24, Quds News Network, Al Mayadeen, Anadolu Agency, even Israel's own Haaretz, all reported the same spectacle, though Western mainstream media is still basically ignoring it entirely. Drones buzzing incessantly overhead, explosions rattling the water, radio smothered by electronic jamming, at least 13 blasts damaging 10 boats, so at time of writing the exact number of boats struck is still being debated depending on which media outlet you happen to be reading. Captains were forced to cluster their vessels together for safety, signalling across the dark with lights and shouted words when their systems failed. Activists described stun grenades falling from the sky, with one passenger sprayed with chemicals, masts shattered by flashbangs. The footage makes it harder to deny as well. There's numerous videos making their way around social media today. Video recorded from the Spectre boat captured one of the blasts as drones circled overhead, whilst organisers released additional clips showing lights across the horizon as ships huddled together in the dark. This was no naval engagement between equals, it was a campaign of harassment, marked by the buzz of drones, the crack of stun grenades, and the deliberate jamming of radios that left ships struggling to coordinate in the night. But by morning, the flotilla was still afloat. There were no casualties, there were no ships sunk, no retreat either. Israel had rattled them, certainly. These are civilians, so not military grouping by any means. But it's not stopped them at all. The attacks achieved almost nothing in practical terms, save to further expose Israel's depravity and their fear. But politically, it's also catastrophic for Israel. Instead of cowing the activists, Tel Aviv gifted them with evidence, video, eyewitnesses, timestamps, proof of drones dropping ordnance on civilian ships in international waters, the very material that demolishes Israel's carefully prepared claim that this flotilla was a Hamas proxy. If these vessels truly were Hamas's navy, as Israel insists, would the response have been flashbangs and radio jamming? Of course not. Israel has obliterated hospitals, schools, residential towers, even refugee camps, all under the banner of security, all under the banner of destroying Hamas's infrastructure. It does not drop stun grenades on Hamas, does it? It drops bombs. So the restraint is the tell here. Israel's not fighting a military threat. It's staging a performance. It wants to scare without killing, to disrupt without massacring, because it knows that an outright slaughter at sea would shred its diplomatic cover globally overnight. Even the most ardent of Israel's allies would struggle to spin their way out of that. But even this halfway house measure exposes its weakness. By failing to stop the flotilla outright, Israel proved what it never wanted admitted, that the siege is not impregnable, it can be resisted. It can be breached, and that actually they fear this could happen. And the desperation to prevent that breach already, whilst still travelling south of Greece currently, makes their blockade look even more fragile than ever. The smear campaign kicked into overdrive, of course, at that point. Having failed to sink the mission physically, Israel have tried to sink it rhetorically. The refusal of Ashkelon was cast as proof that the flotilla was serving Hamas. The convoy was no longer humanitarian but political, its cargo of flour and bandages suddenly recast as weapons in disguise. This is the circular logic of the blockade. Aid is humanitarian only when Israel controls it. Any attempt to bypass that control is redefined as terrorism. In this twisted equation, bread and baby milk become contraband. But facts cut through the spin. 13 British nationals are on board these vessels, European parliamentarians, aid workers, doctors, dockers, cargo holds, stuffed not with rockets but with provisions and medicine. Videos show the faces, show the names, hear the testimony. The flotilla is not Hamas, it's humanity. And that is what terrifies Israel, because they are inhumane, as is their siege. Because if the world accepts that unarmed civilians can deliver aid directly to Gaza, then the entire edifice of their blockade, its lawfulness, its necessity, its supposed security rationale, it all collapses. And collapse is the right word here. The blockade did not look impregnable last night, did it? It looked brittle. It looked like it's cracking. It looks ready to shatter under the weight of the solidarity being shown on those ships. The sound of drones was not the roar of strength, but the whine of Israeli panic. Drones over bread, flashbangs against flour, a blockade cracking under its own fear of baby milk. Now it's worth considering what this means for Britain, since I mentioned several British nationals there. If I bring matters back to here for a second, because it's pertinent. But equally, this applies to any number of other states too. Because for the UK, this is not some abstract matter of distant waters. At least 3 of the flotilla's vessels fly the Union Jack. 2 of them were amongst those harassed by drones. 13 British citizens are aboard these vessels under international maritime law. An attack on a flagged vessel is an attack on the state whose flag it carries. That gives London not only a moral obligation, but a legal one. When Iranian drones menaced oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman in the past, Britain scrambled warships to escort them. Yet when Israeli drones menaced British aid ships, the silence is again deafening. Because the Madeleine, of course, was British flagged too, wasn't it? The hypocrisy this time grows even sharper when you appreciate that Britain has just recognised Palestine as a sovereign state, and these vessels are trying to breach a siege on that state. On Tuesday, there was recognition. On Wednesday, time of writing certainly, there's still silence as ships bound for that state have been attacked. Recognition without protection is an empty gesture. It's a diplomatic sticker to cover the reality of complicity. And Keir Starmer was already being accused of doing this for optics without any real intent. And let's dispense with the excuse of incapacity too, that these are distant waters, because Britain has RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus, one of its most significant overseas bases, already being used, as we know, for surveillance flights over Gaza. If London wanted to monitor, to deter, or even protect its flagged vessels, it absolutely could. The fact it does not is not because it cannot, but because it will not. And this is the other exposure of the flotilla incident last night. It is not only Israel's blockade that is cracking, it is the facade of Western support that sustains it. The UK, the EU, the United States, they all pretend to uphold freedom of navigation, to defend civilians, to protect international law, and those states that have now recognised Palestine face even more scrutiny for that now. Yet when the state attacking aid ships is Israel, they still avert their gaze, it seems. The flotilla is holding up a mirror, and what we see is absolute hypocrisy on their part. And so the questions multiply, don't they? How can Israel claim legality when it sprays chemicals on civilians in international waters? How can Britain or any other state, frankly, ignore their duty when its citizens and its flagged vessels are targeted? How can the international community defend freedom of navigation in the Gulf but abandon it in the Mediterranean? And most of all, what happens if even one ship gets through? That's the nightmare scenario for Israel. Not because a handful of boats could militarily change the situation in Gaza, but because the symbolism would be devastating. The moment aid lands on Gaza's shores without Israeli oversight, that siege is a bust, and more can then follow. The way will have been shown. The story that it is lawful, necessary, and unbreakable is finished. The blockade would be revealed as a wall of paper sustained only by fear of enforcement, and the flotilla is the match that can set it alight. Israel thought it had its story straight. We offered them peace. They refused. We had no choice but to strike. But what the world sees is something else entirely. Israel offered control, was rebuffed, lashed out, and revealed its fear and its panic. This was not the projection of strength. It was a spectacle of panic made visible. The blockade is not made of granite, it's made of glass. And in the glare of those drones and explosions, it's cracking up all the more. I did a bit more of a deep dive into the consequences of just one ship getting through, as well as news that Libya has sent a fully stocked hospital vessel to join the flotilla now. And this video recommendation here is your suggested next watch, so please do check that one out. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.